All right, your host from New York Sea Grant this morning. I've kind of been watching the people who are signing in, and I see some of you I know are off today, so I appreciate you joining in this morning to catch this really interesting webinar, which is the final of our 4-part series. So now a little bit more onto our presentation today, which is predicting aquatic invasions in the Adirondack lakes, and hopefully some of this information might give you guys some new ideas for ways to continue moving forward to protecting your lakes and different water bodies. So our presenter for today is Richard Ross Shaker, and he is an assistant professor of geography and environmental studies at Ryerson University in Toronto, up in Canada. So his research focuses on coupled human environmental systems for environmental planning and natural resources management. And Dr. Shaker has actively been investigating landscape and global change dynamics associated with sustainable development, but then also the management of aquatic resources through the study of land-water interactions in temperate latitudes. And so part of his research is focused around the Adirondacks, which is what he's going to really go very far into detail with today. And again, I just want to remind you all that if you do have any questions about any of this, please submit them in the chat box and we'll address those at the end. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my, I'm going to go ahead and let you take over now.
Okay, thank you so much, Brittany, and thank you all of the participants that decided to join us today on this holiday, holiday for Veterans Day in the US and Remembrance Day in Canada. And I would also like to thank the Sea Grant for providing this opportunity for us to collaborate and work on watercraft inspection and other Sea Grant related issues in New York State. Today I'm going to present some work on predicting aquatic invasions in the Adirondack lakes and providing a spatial analysis of lake and landscape conditions. This research that I'm going to talk about is actually linked to this project in collaboration with APIPP, the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, Ryerson University, some collaborators there, and University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and GeoEco Design out of Syracuse, New York. And it's online open access from the Ecological Society of America publication Ecosphere. The outline for today's webinar, I want to just start really big picture and talk about global change and what's driving global change, and then relate that to landscape dynamics, the impacts of invasive species, and talk briefly about my approach in the methodological and more of a philosophical approach with landscape ecology and indicators, and then move into predicting aquatic invasion using spatial analysis techniques, and how that can be hopefully used in prioritizing watercraft inspection and cleaning sites, boat cleaning sites. As most of you know, most of the environmental problems have been linked to population growth. And this population growth has been projected to continue past 2100. Now, in the developed world, such as North America, Europe, Australia, and even in parts of Europe, we see that those population trends are supposed to level off. The big surprise here is still Africa and the global population. But population really leads to many different things. And primarily we have to feed ourselves the food, the fiber, the fuels, etc., that comes with an increasing population. Fortunately, with this population growth, and we still don't know for sure when population, the projections, when we're going to see that population level off, but we're fortunately, in terms of a landscape approach, 3% roughly of that landscape that's been transitioning is considered urban. And in 2007, that population reached this hallmark in human history where we're now more of an urban species than rural. And in North America, we've been that way for some time now, and we're closer to the 70-80 mark in terms of where our population is living. In this study, looking at global consequences of land use, and we really have to think about what pre-settlement land cover looked like. And the above image here looks at the pre-settlement, pre-human existence of land cover, the potential vegetation. so to speak. And then the bottom two images are actually just the land cover associated with agricultural practices. So you think of that increasing population, we have now modified our landscape to really feed ourselves either directly or indirectly. And you know, up until 1990s, late 90s, 2000, the largest biome was considered forest throughout the world. And we now have reached this place where the largest biome in the world is actually agricultural practices. So some other impacts besides the natural land cover changes that we're seeing, which have its own implications, there are other impacts associated with population growth. The big one, the fragmentation of those natural habitats. Population growth also brings in changes in species composition, such as invasive species, our need for energy and our consumption patterns, our goods and production, increased greenhouse gas concentrations. We disrupt our hydrologic system through urbanization. As an example, compaction of soils. And then we also modify energy flows and nutrient cycling. And of course, this change in land cover, landscape, the consumption of our natural landscape features has been dubbed as one of the most catastrophic events in our human existence. And it's having a really negative impact on our biodiversity. And just to remind everyone, what is the importance of biodiversity? Well, this is the rich variety of species and biological communities that provide us the food, the wood, the fibers, the energy, raw materials, the industrial chemicals, the medicines, all of which, if we just take that economic stance, pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the world's economy. And of course, there are those healing aspects, the healing gardens that we see at hospitals now, the natural affinity of nature, the biophilia that was dubbed by E.O. Wilson, where we assign this non-utilitarian value to a tree or a forest or wild species of all kind. When we think of the decline of speciation or species or the negative impacts on biodiversity, it has been so rightly dubbed in an acronym. What are the major activities by humans and our human forces that are causing the species decline or extinction? And the acronym is dubbed HIPPO by conservation biologists. And this again comes from E.O. Wilson's work, famous evolutionary biologist, emeritus professor at Harvard. Habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, population, and overharvesting. Now, the population increase, which we previously talked about, is driving all of the others. Most of the research in science is pointing that habitat destruction is the single most important factor at causing decline of species and extinction. And there is some debate here, but most of the evidence is pointing that the second most important aspect of causing species extinction is invasive species. Pollution and overharvesting, not to be overlooked, are also having their own significant impacts on land and sea resources. Now, due to just the nature of gravitation, landscape change, habitats are tied to our own landscape, freshwater ecosystems have been considered the most impacted by, freshwater ecosystems have been considered the most impacted by these anthropogenic stressors. In a previous study, this image here shows you looking at landscape configuration, specifically urban designs, and how it relates to the fish index of biotic integrity, building off of Carr's work. And in that study, it showed that the increase in urbanization and the connectivity of urban space and the disconnected tissue of that landscape, of natural landscapes, was declining the aquatic integrity of freshwater systems. In response to protecting our water, there was the Clean Water Act in 1972. The phrase that's been dubbed is it's clean and blue since 72, but there have been amendments that address pollution control strategies, wastewater standards, construction of sewage treatment plants, And those relate to 1977, 1987, and 1990, and we continue to see modifications. But going back to the 1972 language in the Clean Water Act, it set a specific goal of restoring and maintaining the chemical, physical, and I highlight biological integrity of the nation's water. Because just like if we were to live downwind from a polluting sort, let's say a polluting smokestack, we would move. And those are the variable things that are happening with the chemical and physical properties. But the biological integrity are actually those organisms, the species that have to live, that connected ecosystem that has to live in that environment. And that really ties into using biological indicators for assessing clean water. Also in 1972, it defined the word pollution as anything that downgrades the integrity of the water body and by causing harm to humans or human activity. Specific to invasion, when we look at the cost on governmental response, because I think we underestimate the true cost of invasion. And we'll just talk about invasive species here in the grandest context. The severe economic impacts are evident. And by Pimentel in 2001, which is considered a hallmark, and their work in 2005, showed that roughly 5% of the global economy is tied to invasive species. In the United States alone, estimated economic damages and control costs associated with invasive species is roughly $120 billion annually. And from that federal standpoint, there was an executive order in response to direct several federal agencies to prevent the introduction of invasive species and provide their control to minimize the economic, ecological, and human health impacts that invasive. When we start thinking about what are the major factors, the driving factors of this interconnected integrity of water resources, when we're looking at the aquatic ecological system or the principal goals of the clean water impact, we start looking at the chemical variables. It can be broken into 5 major factors that help determine this integrity of aquatic resources. Chemical variables, biotic factors, energy sources, habitat structure, and flow regime. And if you were to try to gather this data, this information, doing in situ field research, data collection, you can see that it is a very difficult and costly venture. Another grand reason to using biological indicators to help us assess our integrity of water resources. Now, looking at the literature and reviewing the literature in terms of spreading aquatic invaders, and specific to our study area in the Adirondack lakes, we would see that small craft boats are considered one of the most significant propagators of aquatic invaders. When we think of the Great Lakes, the large craft boats, the bilge water, some other factors for spreading aquatic invaders, bait dumping, number of game fish present, so fishing practices, native species, the competition that's happening between native and invasives, the types of boat ramps, is it publicly or privately owned property around the lake, proximity to populated place, road runoffs, highway exits, nearest invaded waterways, so distance to the nearest invasion. Of course, our lake morphology, the area, the depth, substrate material, lake chemistry, pH, alkalinity, phosphorus, conductivity, the euphotic zone, the depth in which sun reaches into that water, and the shading, aquatic shading, the shading around the region, the riparian zone, and lake elevation, the riparian land use, land cover types, and water and climate change variables, just to name a few. In terms of the research objectives of the study that we were working on in the Adirondacks, it had 3 main research objectives that guided the study. The first one was, could we use the data that's provided by APIPP in their annual report, the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program's annual report of aquatic invaders and terrestrial invaders, to look at and create a simple index, the aquatic invasive species richness, to assess just a grand distribution of aquatic invasion across the Adirondack region, using specifically data from 126 lakes. The second one, so the first one is just looking at the where. Where is the invasion happening across that large region, roughly the size of Vermont? And the second one was to look at more inference or cause effect. What are the lake and landscape characteristics that are linking both positively and negatively to that indicator of aquatic integrity or the invasive species richness? And then also in that process to look at local and global statistical models. Now this is a little bit maybe different or new to you guys, but the local modeling is including the actual spatial relationship, the specific geographical location, latitude and longitude of the information in each lake, and comparing and contrasting that to its neighbors, or including the neighboring relationships in the analysis of the statistical inference. So there was a comparison between traditional, which is the without space, global statistical techniques, and the local statistical techniques, which allow us some really interesting new tools for showing local relationships or patterning. Now, in order to really fully understand my approach, and everyone has their own approach when they do these types of analyses, and my scientific epistemology or approach comes in this world of landscape ecology. This is a paradigm that started in 1939. It gets contributed to, or gets attributed to Carl Troll's work, which really looks at, well, what is landscape ecology? It's considered a discipline, a multidisciplinary discipline that combines the spatial approach of the geographer and the functional approach of an ecologist. And in kind of summarizing what are the incorporations or the things that landscape ecologists do, they look at, one, the spatial relationships among landscape elements or ecosystems, and two, the flow of energy, minerals, nutrients, and species among the elements, and the ecological dynamics of the landscape mosaic through time. So we have our spatial relationships, our cause-effect relationships, the ecological elements, and not only spatial, but temporal changes. And when we look specifically, what are the elements? And we use geographic information systems and remote sensing, which I'll define here in a second for you, but we're using computer-aided technology to help us assess what's going on in the world. So you can think about when you look out your window, all of that information is now being categorized and collected in a digital environment. And when we look at specifically land cover, which can be linked to the soil, the geology, the water table, that's telling us a lot that's happening collectively in using land cover. This image here on the right is actually the United Kingdom with urban patches, just urban patches, urban land cover patches, and the rest is just blank. Okay, so just to show you what the patch is that fundamental element in the landscape, that one land cover or land use type, in comparison to something else in its class format. And the patch is the primary component that help us to assess these analytical metrics that really are capturing design, the landscape geometry, the connectivity of space, the fragmentation of land covers, which help us to assess these shapes and land covers in a more specific and robust format. So that helps us in terms of our predictions and how we are independent variable, those factors that we're going to use to predict our indicator. Now I mentioned earlier that the index that we used came from the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program and their annual report. And it was just a simple summation of the present aquatic invaders in each lake. And so we created this index so we could use an indicator-based assessment of landscape function. So looking at what are all those factors, both in the lake that we could capture and our landscape and try to link it back to that aquatic invasion index. And these are considered key at assessing landscape function for planning purposes, environmental management purposes. They're obligatory tools. They're kind of a calibration system for calibrating what's the function or the processes that are happening in the landscape. And specific to aquatic ecology, these biological endpoints can be considered almost all-encompassing or capturing the biota, the connected or interconnected ecosystem, and perhaps the stress or the status of that ecosystem. So in the study area that we're working with here is the Adirondack Park, which most of you are familiar with. It's the US's largest state level park. It encompasses roughly 5.9 million acres, roughly the size of Vermont, to give you some contrast. And some of the most, there's some debate here on the number of lakes and size of lakes and streams, but in a recent study by some colleagues at Paul Smith College, they found that there's roughly 400 square miles of lakes and roughly 8,000 miles of streams. Okay, roughly half of the park is in the Great Lakes Basin, and there are roughly 12 counties that intersect the park boundary, with 2 counties entirely within its boundaries. Some of the neat habitats here that we see are wetlands, old growth forest, which of course that was the fundamentals, the forest preserved lands of 1892 were the fundamentals of building this larger forest preserve in Adirondack Park. But it has steadily increased in size through time. There are over 100 towns and villages and roughly 130,000 permanent residents, roughly 200,000 seasonal residents, and more than 6 million visitors that come into the park annually each year. And it's right on that corridor between Montreal and New York City, so we could see that there's a lot of traffic that coming both from Canada and the US from those massive cities into this park. In terms of roads, there's roughly 8,000 kilometers of paved road, half of which are considered local roads. And specific to aquatic impairment in the Adirondack Park, most of the research has pointed to poor land use practices, which we could say applies to almost anywhere when we talk about water quality. And then more specific, I would say, to the Northeast is the acidification through our old industrial past in the Midwest and Rust Belt now, and that deposition, which has caused roughly half of the lakes to be below 5.5 in pH. So if we say that those are the major causes of aquatic impairment, I would still argue that the greatest threat, and I think our colleagues here would also agree, to park biodiversity is coming from the terrestrial and aquatic invasive species. Now, aquatic invasion has been assessed since 2001 through this public-private partnership with the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, and that's been around since 1998. Collaboration with New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Department of Transportation, and over 700 volunteers working across 30 cooperating organizations. If you know, in a scientific context, I wouldn't be able to find grant money enough to try to pull off what this organization has been able to pull off with the collaborations. This is a very unique opportunity to be able to work with APIPP on this study. So since 2001, those 11 invasive species that have been monitored are Eurasian water milfoil, variable leaf milfoil and curly leaf pondweed, yellow floating heart, European frogbite, spiny water flea, zebra mussels, water chestnut, brittle naiad, Asian clam, and fanwort. Specifically to the macrophytes, those water plants, Eurasian water milfoil is pretty spread out through the park now, and we could say that even in the Northeast, this is this invasive species is very dispersed, and many of us are fighting with trying to management Eurasian water milfoil. Now, the other species, curly leaf pondweed, is right there, coming on strong next, and some of the others also. A map from 2003 just shows the presence of an invasive species, not how many or what have you, but in the park, you can see invasive species versus non-invasive species. In terms of being assessed, there's actually, there's still, in terms of the lakes that are being assessed, there's still almost double the amount of lakes that are non-invaded compared to invaded. And through time, they continually to assess more and more lakes. Specific to this study, we were able to narrow our lake samples down to 126 lakes. I think we went with 25 hectares as our smallest lake, just for data assurance. Some of the data sources that we were pulling from, they're not going to assess lakes that are smaller than that. That could have been a limitation to the study. But specifically to that 126 lakes, in 2013, the data that we were using, and this has now changed, but the maximum number of invasive species in one lake was 8, and that was Lake Champlain. I think there are 9 now in Lake Champlain. But in this study, 52% of our lakes were invaded, 48 were non-invaded. The distribution here is what we would expect when we think of an accumulating rare event like lots of invasive species. It's called a Poisson distribution, which requires some specific statistical methods. But in just describing a Poisson distribution, you can think of a very compounding rare event, like perhaps how many different invasive species. So we would expect that we would see many lakes with 0 or 1 invasive species, and then a few more lakes with 2, and maybe just a few more, right? And then as we become more and more invasive species, the likelihood of having a lake that has all of these becomes lower. Specific to those 126 lakes, this is the spatial distribution of is it invaded or not. The blue lakes were the non-invaded lakes. The orange here are the invaded, has an invasive species in it. And just to go back to our main technologies that we were using, and some of the data were already provided for us, specifically from remote sensing, the land cover data and elevation-based data. We didn't use climate-based variables with this study. It was specific to lake and landscape, but those would also be used in remote sensing, which uses satellite, aircrafts, drones, and other platforms to capture information on Earth's surface. We're doing this all the time now. And the digital ortho images are a key aspect, and of course those land cover data sets from the U.S. Geological Society. In terms of building the database, we use Geographic Information Systems, which is software that's capable of inputting, storing, manipulating, analyzing, and actually displaying geographical data. And there are many freewares now that are very capable of doing this. But for the most part, we're using the pay-for ArcGIS ESRI software. Now, just to help visualize for those that aren't as familiar to GIS and remote sensing, you have vector-based data, which is considered discrete, the points, lines, and polygons, and raster-based data, which is coming in more pixel format, which is assigning a signature through light signature and its reflectance in that electromagnetic spectrum to help us classify and determine what the data are actually telling us. I apologize for the small type here, but I just wanted to show you the data that we were able to put together in this database to try to predict aquatic invasive species richness across the Adirondacks. Of course, our response variable, or the thing we were looking at, is just that the AISR, or invasive species richness index, and lake area, lake perimeter area ratio. Those data were coming from the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation of New York. they provided the shape file, which is the discrete data on the lake shape, which was drawn from an orthophoto. We calculated the rest. Depth was coming from, and this is maybe the one real unique source here, was the Fisherman's Guide, the Sportsman's Connect Fisherman's Guide. We were able to get the number of game species present and some of the lake variables, like the maximum depth of that lake. Lake surface elevation came from the US. We used elevation data from the USGS. The lake access type, the carry down only, or was it a public launch? That came from the Sportsman's Guide. And then distance to I-87 corridor, which was a really important transit corridor through that park, the Department of Transportation, the census, distance to nearest populated place, and of course the land cover data, both compositions and configuration, which came from, the sources came from the U.S. Geological Society, the 2010 land cover data for New York. And so in terms of spatial analysis, we looked at the spatial distribution and the numerical distribution to see, do these data violate parametric tests, which is really the traditional tests like correlations coefficient or regression. So we had to make some adjustments there. And then which ones were cross-correlated or redundant of each other. And then we got into inference, or the cause-effect relationships between the lake and landscape variables and the aquatic invasive species richness using correlation coefficient analysis. And OLS stands for ordinary least squares regression, so traditional regression, but multiple traditional regression. And then the multiple geographical weighted regression, as I previously specified, was using the same models, but also including their spatial relationships or their neighboring spatial relationships into consideration. And then, of course, from those results, we want to try to interpret the results and inform, and hopefully, if everything goes as planned, informed proper environmental management or strategies for combating invasive species in this case. So just a little bit more detail in terms of the univariate distribution or the spatial distribution of aquatic invasive species richness. We use this thing known as exploratory spatial data analysis. And in the global context, is it locally clustered? Are your neighbors or the neighboring lakes more similar than the further away ones? And this is known as the first law of geography, which things in space are more similar as they're closer together. And as we move further away, they become less similar. And we take that into consideration to help us determine hotspots. And the hotspot analysis that we used is a local index of spatial association using a distance threshold of 50 kilometers. So that is the where, like displaying where the hotspots of aquatic invasive species richness are. And then going into the next step, which is just the bivariate correlations between our aquatic invasive species richness and all of those lake and landscape predictors. Some of the other softwares that we used, so ArcGIS is the mapping software, or the Geographic Information System software. FragStats is a free software that has to do with the configurations and shapes of the land covers, because that was still an area of research that has been kind of underutilized. JMP is a statistical software paid for by SAS. And then spatial analysis for macroecology is one of my favorites, is a freeware, and it's a very strong spatial analysis statistical software. So just one more note on the method, this geographical weighted regression, because I think it's still a relatively new method. It's considered a refinement to traditional regression. It uses a distance decay weighted philosophy. So again, like that first law of geography, as things are closer in space, they become more similar. As they move further away, they become less similar. I think we can agree to that. And so it takes that into account, that your neighboring locations the closer those neighboring locations are to the specific site, the more it's having an influence. And as you move further away, it has less of an influence. This is known as a spatial drift method, employing a series of local linear regressions to help us with that modeling technique. One of the limitations to geographical weighted regression is that it's not suitable for extrapolation beyond its local modeling location because it's using the specific spatial locations. And this is just to help illustrate the geographical weighted regression. You have your specific location point and then looking at the neighboring locations around there and taking that into consideration, and it's moving across space while it's determining those spatial relationships. So going specific to the hotspot analysis, we see that there is a strong hotspot along, or this more saturation of aquatic invasive species richness or increased richness of those invaders along the I-87 corridor. And then, of course, there's another unique hotspot that is in the 1932-1980 Olympic region, Lake Placid being kind of the central part there in the hotspot in Franklin County. And then also, I guess, unique to Franklin County is that there is a pretty significant cold spot in Franklin County too. So this would be a really interesting area to pay attention to in terms of environmental management. The other regions, this is spatial relationship. Now there are aquatic invaders here throughout this region, but in terms of their spatial relationship to each other, it's considered randomly distributed. When we take the data, those same data, and we interpolate it, just like we would do with temperature. So we spread that, make it into a surface across the region. You can start to flesh out, you can start to see the cooler spots in these regions and the hotter spots. And east of the park, the east side of the park, along that I-87 corridor and those larger lakes are definitely an area of concern. And then the Olympic Village region around Lake Placid, also an area of concern. When we start thinking of the cause-effect factors, we go back to those stressor agents, the habitat structure, the flow regime, the water quality, energy sources, and biotic interactions. And we start to look at what are the main predictors of aquatic invasion in this case. And some of the big ones, and I'll just kind of just talk about the ones, the most significant variables that came out in terms of negative relationship. So as you increase in lake surface elevation, you have a decreased likelihood of having more aquatic invaders. Now, if you have more game fish present, you have a higher likelihood of having more aquatic invaders. You know, so this could support the small craft boats, perhaps entanglements in your props, but also bait dumping, fishing gear, entanglement in fishing gear, etc. Another positive predictor was the developed intensity, so medium land cover, developed medium land intensity. There's no massive cities up here, so you're not going to have that high intensity. But a medium intensity developed land was a strong predictor, suggesting that either there's a large human component to this directly through fishing and population, or perhaps some indirect measures like perhaps a combined sewer system, nutrient enrichment, runoff, and perhaps fertilizers and pesticides, herbicide use locally. Another really strong predictor was relative patch richness, which is really the number of different land cover types around the 300-meter landscape that we were using in the riparian zone, which really suggests that fragmentation. As we make those land cover types more diverse in this region, we are actually fragmenting from that natural habitat, suggesting that there could be more of a human aspect, or there's chemistry-related topics to this. Two that I don't have highlighted, but I want to talk about that came back as negative predictors of aquatic invasive species richness were deciduous forest and evergreen forest. Now, this could be capturing maybe lower access to the lake, but there's also been a lot of evidence combined with acid deposition that were affecting the dissolved organic carbon in the lake, which is actually decreasing it through binding aluminum and the alkalinity in lakes, which changes the mobility of organic material and thus lowering that dissolved organic carbon in the lake. When we start looking at the models and how they're interacting collectively, we start to go, okay, when we start to combine these models, and there were 5 different models that were considered statistically independent, meaning the predictors are working together independently to describe that outcome. And when we look at across the models, the number 1 variable that came up was distance to nearest invaded lake. That would be the strongest predictor, and as the distance increases, we have a lesser chance of having aquatic invaders. That should make sense, and that fits really nicely with our first law of geography that we're talking about. The second most important variable was lake surface elevation, and as we increase in elevation, we decrease in the number of aquatic invasive species. And then the third one that I want to talk about is the distance to nearest interstate highway exit to that lake, and that was, again, negative. So if we start thinking about these things in combination, as the lake is further away from I-87, and it's also increased or higher in elevation, and it's closer to another invaded lake, it becomes much more at risk to a new invader. When we add in the spatial relationships, we actually, and just to kind of the modeling aspects, we were pretty strong in the modeling. 66% of the variation was our best model here in terms of modeling and capturing that variation of aquatic invasive species richness. When we add in the spatial aspect and the neighboring aspects of these lakes, we moved all the way up into the 83 range of that variation, which in terms of statistics is very strong, especially with something like aquatic invaders. So we feel pretty happy about the results that were received, and all of the directionality maintained the same. And one real neat thing that we can do with this then is we can use the predicted expression, which I'll show you here in a second, to actually combine and give us a score for the number of the possibility or the lakes that are likely going to be the ones at risk in the future. Now, also with this technique, this geographical weighted regression, because it is a local technique, meaning it uses the spatial relationships, we can actually provide the lakes that have that association. So even with a regression, let's talk about height and weight. As we increase, as a human increases in height, they oftentimes increase in weight. Well, those things would make sense, but that isn't always the case. If we had a spatial location, some of those people may not statistically fit into that category. If we just look at lake area, which fits very nicely with the species area curve, as we increase in lake area, we should have more aquatic invaders. That would make sense. But there's a region here, this blacked out region, that was locally non-significant. So although the phenomenon, lake area, as lake area increases, there's a little more likelihood for aquatic invaders. It isn't necessarily always likely locally the case. Just like in distance to nearest invader, all of the lakes except for Lake George in this case did not come back. They all were significantly significant except for this Lake George at the 95% confidence interval. At the 90th% confidence interval, Lake George also was. And so that's a really interesting kind of newer methodology, technology to show which ones are actually supporting that local phenomenon and which ones are not. In terms of management strategies, I actually think that the local general trend is providing a much, probably a more likely transferable knowledge in terms of those kind of ideas and management strategies. So you can also map those things out locally using the interpolation method to show where there might be local gaps where it's not true or not happening. We also can see that across the park, on the eastern edge of the park, we were doing a much better job, a much stronger job of modeling that aquatic invasive species. As we moved westward, our models were not, this model, Model 5, was not as reliable. Elevation, statistically significant for the most part on the eastern side of the park, but as we move westward, not as much. Distance to I-87, a little bit more spread out. And I guess with traditional statistics and both with geographical weighted regression, one of the really interesting aspects is that you can use those models to help us to come up with a predictive expression or a predictive combined estimate in this case. So we were able to take, since all of the 126 lakes were used in the model and we were used in the geographical weighted regression technique, we were able to then take out the roughly half non-invaded lakes and prioritize from those 60, what are the top 20 at risk to invasion? And interesting enough, some of these lakes that came up here were not specifically lakes that APIPP were considering at the time prior to this study to assess as at-risk lakes. And here are those lakes again. With that hotspot that we showed before, Franklin County also is showing that it has 6 of these lakes that are potentially out of the top 20 in a relatively small region, and closer to the I-87 in Essex County, also Hamilton having quite a few lakes. Regarding invasive species management, as you know, since you guys are in this session, you understand that once these invasive species come online, there's early detection and you start to manage actively and try to eradicate. But oftentimes these things are continuous in terms of invasive species control and management. So prioritizing resources are really important in modeling techniques. So we would say that these predictive tools are essential to maximizing invasive monitoring and conservation efforts, specifically in regions reliant on abundant freshwater resources to sustain its economic welfare, social equity, and ecological services. Specific to lake elevation, just a little bit more a note here. We assumed that previously that small craft boats was a massive, one of the key propagators for aquatic invasive species richness, but perhaps lake elevation is capturing some of that driving behavior too. As we have more complexity in mountains, we're putting more strain on automobile towing, but I think also the natural landscape, the complexity of topography, and the connectivity of natural flowages needs to be investigated further. Most of these invasive species do a fairly good job of floating downstream. Most of them don't do a very good job of floating upstream, so that would make sense to us. Also, elevation could be capturing some of the slope topography aspects which relate to runoff and infiltration, and ultimately chemistry, both surface and geological subsurface impacts on chemistry, specifically to the Adirondack Park, which we have mostly metamorphic rock with some igneous rock above that, and then in the lower lying areas, sedimentary rock. We would say that the bedrock and the superficial rock is likely not having a huge impact on the chemistry, but that still needs to be fleshed out in research. Some of the key aspects with watercraft inspection, the results of this study inform that inexpensive and publicly accessible lake and landscape data can be used to predict aquatic invasion with remarkable agreement. Reducing infestations by implementing innovative spread and prevention programs such as boat launch stewardships and boat wash programs at strategic water sites, enriching a region-wide early detection network that uses professional and volunteers to detect and report new infestations, and ultimately managing the established populations to mitigate their negative impacts. So really using these tools and technologies to help us determine what are the most beneficial ways to prioritize our resource. And then just in conclusion, I just want to use some of this information from the evolutionary biologist on collective animal behavior. And if we think of informed behavioral changes, the success of a colony, and if we think of the people that are coming to the Adirondack Park, can ultimately be determined based off of the people that are working there. And the workers, their ability to distribute themselves effectively and efficiently to respond to specific issues, specifically in this case to aquatic invasive richness or invasive management, and how we respond as a group to those environmental conditions. And it's also been found that that a large group, within a large group, the smaller the proportion of informed individuals can actually guide the whole unit. So the larger the group, the smaller of proportion of informed individuals are needed to guide that unit, which gives us a lot of hope in terms of environmental management and education and outreach. As long as we keep continually informing and promoting different management strategies, we're ultimately starting to see that shift in behavioral change and responses to these aquatic invaders. So in my last slide here, I'd also like to acknowledge there would be no way possible for me to be able to complete this study without my colleagues, Aaron Venny-Volrath at the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, Arthur Yakuba at the University, the Binghamton University, State University of New York, Stephanie Nick from GeoEco Design out of Syracuse, New York, Tim Ellinger from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and Wayne Forsythe from Ryerson University. And that's where I will conclude my presentation. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, so it looks like nobody has any questions. If you guys do, please feel free to unmute yourself at this point. But again, Rich, thank you so much for your presentation this morning. It was really in-depth in the research, and I hope that it's kind of got some people's gears going to see where we can continue this kind of work moving forward and looking at New York State as a whole and trying to find ways to slow down the spread of invasive species or new invasives from being introduced into New York. Yeah, so Rich, if you can go ahead and ask, I mean, does anybody think that this study like this would be useful for your organizations? Anyone on the line feel interested in that they could find a way to incorporate this into their work?
I guess that's a big question for us on the research side, is trying to operationalize our research into applied practice. And obviously this kind of a study requires a certain level of quantitative knowledge and spatial analysis knowledge. And would we be able to, move forward and to see, results like this inform or help modify management strategies?
Absolutely. It seems like we kind of have a quiet bunch this morning, but we did get another question though as well. So can this type of study be done with terrestrial invasives as well?
Yes, yeah. It depends on the data, how the data are recorded, but absolutely. And we have been starting to reach out a bit with APIPP and working with their terrestrial group. It really comes down to how are the data collected? How long ago do you have both presence and absence of? I mean, that's a real strong benefit to record not only the data where things are, like where the invasive species are, but where they're not. That actually becomes a really strong tool for us. But absolutely, I think that's the goal, that these results and the methodology are highly transferable to other aquatic regions, but also terrestrial.
So it looks like those are all the questions. So Rich, Aaron did ask if there's any additional lake-specific data that you could use that you don't have already. If any of that, let her know for that.
Sure, and I guess for those that are still listening, and I mean the data sets that Aaron and others at APIPP have been putting together are phenomenal. I think it's amazing. When we think about the big issue I see is, you know, if we're talking 10,000 lakes or what have you, or maybe not that many, but a massive amount, it's trying to figure out how to employ and collect data across those entire regions. Because we may have to use different types of remote sensing or proxies like in this study, because it's impossible for us to go out and sample the specific lake chemistry across that whole entire region.
So another question was that, so now that you have this model created, kind of moving forward for the next steps, are you able to expand that into predictions to other lakes right within the Adirondack?
That's a great question. We certainly could. We could redo the study. We would have to, because of the method we use, the geographical weighted regression method, that's specific to that time and the spatial data set. So you have to go back and include all of the new data that you would want to include in those models. One great thing about this study for us in the Adirondacks is we're seeing these specific variables are important. Now, I'm not 100% sure if elevation would be as important if we were doing a study, let's say in the upper Mississippi Valley or somewhere where, or if we're in the Great Plains. Yeah, it would still be important, but would it be as important? And it's very unique to the Adirondacks with its 46 high peaks, the lakes, the mountains, the interconnected river network, and those road networks. So this methodology, it provides a very unique but almost case-by-case specific modeling technique. Sure, the land cover types and boat types and the type of ramps and number of ramps, all of that is very important and it fits well with the literature. But being able to prioritize the future lakes really is reliant on the specific data and the region in which you're assessing.
Great, thank you so much. I guess if anyone else has a question, we can answer that, but I'll go through and kind of close up this morning. So I do want to go ahead and share an announcement with you guys. Sorry about that. So we are hosting, New York Sea Grant is hosting a training for watercraft inspection programs May 21st through 23rd and May 23rd through the 25th. And so those are in Western New York and in the lower Hudson region. And these trainings will include watercraft inspection demonstrations, data collection using the Survey 123 training, or training for Survey 123, and boater safety course and a lot more as well, just beyond that. And so with that, if you're interested in any of that or kind of hearing more information, please feel free to reach out to Rich. He's more than happy to answer questions and kind of expand on what he talks about today and maybe even possibly partner in the future. And so again, Rich, thank you so much for your presentation this morning. It was great, and it was really nice to hear about a different perspective of kind of the research world connecting to the work that we're all already doing.
Thank you so much, Brittany, for the opportunity, and for everyone else for joining us with the talk today.
Yeah, great. Thank you again. And so on behalf of Sea Grant, I hope everybody has a great day. Thanks for joining us on your holiday, kind of listening in for this. And this is the final webinar of our series. And so I'm working on the editing of the recordings, getting those online. And so I know there was a lot of information covered specifically with this webinar. So if you want to go back through and kind of re-listen to some of the work and check out the publications, we'll also put a link to that on our website. So again, thanks, Rich, and thanks for everybody else, and I hope everyone has a great day. All right.